1888, in the eastern part of London, in the Whitechapel district, several murders occurred, which initially were not linked to each other. It was one of the poorest districts of the city, overpopulated, with a constant flow of migrants, lodging houses, and temporary workers. Disappearances of people happened here regularly and rarely caused an immediate reaction from the authorities. The situation changed in the autumn of the same year, when the police and newspapers began to receive letters signed with the name Jack the Ripper. Part of the letters was published in the Star and the Central News, and it was they that created the sensation that one criminal was operating in the city with a recognizable handwriting. Today, 5 victims are officially associated with this name: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. All of them lived on the edge of survival, did not have a permanent income, and often slept in shelters. Their movements were almost not recorded, and the absence of a person might be noticed only days later. The investigation turned out to be fragmented from the very beginning. Responsible for the case simultaneously were the Metropolitan Police, the City of London Police, and private detectives. A unified headquarters did not exist. Evidence was kept in different places, and the testimonies of witnesses often contradicted each other. Additional confusion was introduced by the press. Newspapers published rumors, unverified versions, and details which later turned out to be inaccurate. Some letters attributed to the Ripper were likely written by journalists or pranksters, but at the moment of publication they were taken seriously and influenced the course of the investigation. Suspects appeared regularly: doctors, butchers, foreigners, representatives of the middle class. However, not one of them was officially charged. Part of the case materials was lost, part destroyed, and many decisions were made under the pressure of public panic. Over time, the investigation hit a dead end. The name Jack the Ripper remained, but the person behind it did not. The history turned into a myth, where the figure of the criminal became more important than the circumstances, and the real victims secondary. H. Holmes. In the early 1890s, a man appeared in Chicago who introduced himself as a doctor and a successful entrepreneur. He called himself H. Holmes, although his real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. At that time, changing a name did not require complex checks, and a person's past rarely aroused interest if he looked respectable and spoke confidently. Chicago was preparing for the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. Thousands of people were flocking to the city from all over the country: temporary workers, visiting women, young people without connections and permanent housing. Many of them disappeared from the view immediately after arrival, and this was not considered something unusual. Holmes opened a pharmacy on South Wallace Avenue and then began gradually rebuilding the building, adding new premises. Workers were constantly changing. Floor plans were not kept in one form, and the internal structure of the building was becoming increasingly confusing. From the outside, it looked like the ordinary confusion of a rapidly growing business. People who got a job with Holmes or temporarily stayed in his house sometimes went missing. Disappearances were not linked to each other. Some were considered to have left, others to have changed their name or job. Complaints, if they appeared, were considered in isolation. In parallel, Holmes was actively engaged in insurance fraud. He took out policies on employees and business partners, listing himself as the beneficiary of payments. It was precisely suspicions of fraud that first attracted the serious attention of the police to him, and not reports of missing people. After the arrest, details began to surface that previously had not aroused suspicion. Discrepancies in documents, false biographies, testimonies of relatives of missing people. Investigators gradually realized that they were dealing not with separate episodes, but with a chain of events stretching over years and several states. It is important that Holmes was detained not thanks to complex operational work. He became noticeable only when he crossed the line of financial crimes. Disappearances of people were not considered a priority for a long time. because they happened against the backdrop of urban anonymity and chaos. Ted Bundy. The story of Ted Bundy began in the late 70s of the last century. In the states of Washington and Utah, reports began coming in about the disappearance of young women. The cases looked unconnected. Different cities, different circumstances, absence of obvious witnesses. Only later did it become clear that behind them stood one man, Ted Bundy. Bundy lived in Seattle, studied at the University of Washington, and worked as a volunteer on a helpline for people in crisis states. He was familiar with psychology, knew how to listen, and made the impression of a reliable person. His name did not arouse suspicion. On the contrary, many described him as polite and intelligent. He often appeared in public places, university campuses, libraries, parks. He used one and the same image, a person with an injury to the arm or leg who needed help. This technique worked precisely because Bundy looked safe and did not cause alarm. The police received descriptions of a suspect in which the name Ted figured. But there were too many such coincidences. Reports from different cities were not combined into one case, and information between states was transmitted slowly. Bundy came into the police's field of view several times, but each time left without charges. In 1974, he was detained in the state of Utah on a charge of kidnapping. However, he received a comparatively lenient sentence. Later, he managed to escape from custody twice, taking advantage of the fact that he was perceived as a smart but not dangerous criminal. These escapes became the turning point of the case. The trials of Bundy took place with huge attention from the press. He refused lawyers and represented his defense himself, which was a rarity even for that time. The public image gradually displaced the real stories of the missing women, many of whom long remain nameless. John Wayne Gacy. Like the story of the previous killer, it began in the late 70s, but in a different place. Chicago, in the city of Des Plaines, lived a man named John Wayne Gacy. He owned the construction company PDM Contractors, participated in local politics, and regularly appeared at public events. For neighbors and colleagues, Gacy was an example of an active and successful resident of the district. He was a member of the Democratic Party of Cook County, took photos with politicians, and participated in charity actions. Sometimes he performed at holidays in a clown costume under the pseudonym Pogo. This image, family-oriented, public, safe, served as protection for him for a long time. The first reports about the disappearance of teenagers and young men did not cause alarm. Many of them worked temporarily, were looking for part-time work, or had recently moved. A part indeed had contact with Gacy through his business, but this was not perceived as something suspicious. The situation changed in 1978 after the disappearance of Robert Piest, who was last seen at Nissen Pharmacy. He was talking to Gacy about possible work, and after that went missing. Piest's parents insisted on active actions by the police, and the case received high priority. The investigation was headed by Detective Joseph Kozenjak, who discovered that Gacy's name had already figured in other complaints. A check revealed his past conviction in the state of Iowa, about which practically no one in Illinois knew. A search of the house on Summerdale Avenue initially did not yield direct evidence. However, the attention of investigators was attracted by the space under the house and the smell to which neighbors pointed. Under the house, the bodies of Gacy's victims were recovered, which became one of the most resonant cases of America of those years. Further actions of the police quickly took the case beyond the scope of an ordinary investigation, and in the end, Gacy was sentenced to the death penalty. Dennis Rader, BTK. In January 1974, in the city of Wichita, Kansas, the police encountered a case that immediately went beyond the scope of an ordinary investigation. Soon, a letter arrived at the editorial office of the Wichita Eagle newspaper. The author described what happened in detail and signed with the abbreviation BTK, bind, torture, kill. The man standing behind the letters was named Dennis Rader. However, for decades this name did not evoke any associations. Rader lived in Park City, worked as an electrician later, as a code compliance officer, wrote fines for violations, and regularly had contact with residents. He was an active parishioner of Christ Lutheran Church, where he held a leadership position in the church council. Neighbors knew him as a strict but law-abiding person who demanded order and observance of rules. BTK letters arrived irregularly. Sometimes years passed between them. They used newspaper clippings, diagrams, and encrypted messages. Rader carefully monitored the reaction of the police and media, adjusting his behavior depending on the attention. The investigation in Wichita was suspended repeatedly. Investigative teams were dissolved, materials were archived, new detectives started almost from scratch. Over time, the feeling was created that BTK had either left the city or ceased his activity. In 2004, after almost 30 years of silence, BTK made contact again. He sent letters to the TV channel KAKE and the police, and then handed over a floppy disk with files. In one of the messages, he directly asked if information from the carrier could be traced. The answer was affirmative. Supposedly, it is impossible. The metadata of the floppy disk pointed to the name Dennis and the Church Christ Lutheran. Further verification quickly led the police to Rader, who was arrested in February 2005. This case was completed not thanks to a confession or accidental find. It ended because a man who had controlled his presence for decades decided to remind about himself again, and turned out to be vulnerable before the most ordinary technology. Zodiac Killer. One of the most popular and still uncaught serial killers has his origins in the late 1960s in the San Francisco Bay Area. Several crimes occurred in different places: Vallejo, Benicia, Lake Berryessa, and the outskirts of San Francisco. At first glance, they did not look like part of one series. The connection appeared when the editorial offices of the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and Vallejo Times-Herald began to receive letters. Their author signed with the name Zodiac Killer and demanded the publication of his messages on the front pages. The letters contained details that had not been published previously, as well as encrypted texts. One of them, known as Z408, was decrypted by schoolteacher Donald Hardin and his wife Betty Hardin. The message did not contain a name, but demonstrated the author's desire for control and publicity. The investigation was conducted by several agencies at once: Vallejo Police, San Francisco Police, the Napa County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI. A unified coordination center did not exist, and information often got stuck between jurisdictions. Zodiac actively manipulated attention. He changed the style of letters, used different symbols, and sometimes attributed crimes to himself that he likely did not commit. This complicated separating real episodes from disinformation. One of the most discussed suspects became Arthur Lee Allen, a resident of Vallejo. His name figured in witness testimonies, but direct evidence was never found. Later, DNA analyses did not give a definitive answer. The last confirmed Zodiac letters were received in the early 1970s. After that, contact ceased. There was neither an arrest nor a confession, nor a point at which the investigation could conclude. This case still remains open, and the criminal has never been found. Green River Killer. In King County, Washington State, bodies of women began to be found along the Green River, as well as in forest zones near Auburn, Kent, and SeaTac. The majority of victims were linked to street prostitution, and in the early stages, their disappearances did not cause an urgent reaction. The investigation received the name Green River Task Force and became one of the largest in the state's history. Dozens of detectives, FBI agents, and criminologists participated in it. Nevertheless, despite the scale, the case quickly faced a problem. Many victims were not officially reported as missing. One of the first suspects became Gary Ridgway, a painter from the Kenworth Truck Company plant. He had already come into the police's field of view, underwent interrogations, and even a test on a polygraph, which he formally passed. This allowed him to be excluded from the active circle of suspects for years. Ridgway lived an ordinary life, was married, worked regularly, and did not leave the district. He did not attract attention, did not communicate with the press, and did not strive for publicity. Unlike many other cases, here there were no letters, threats, or attempts at communication. The investigation continued for over 20 years. The case moved forward only in the early 2000s when a repeated DNA analysis gave a match. In 2001, Ridgway was arrested and later pleaded guilty to 49 counts of murder and was sentenced to 49 life terms. Jeffrey Dahmer. In the late 1980s in the Milwaukee area, Wisconsin, reports began to come in about strange occurrences in one and the same residential complex, Oxford Apartments. Neighbors complained about smells and noise, however. Appeals were not considered as a reason for a serious check. The man living in one of the apartments was named Jeffrey Dahmer. He led a reclusive lifestyle, rarely communicated with neighbors, and did not attract special attention. The police had already dealt with him previously, but these episodes were not perceived as part of a broader picture. One of the most discussed moments became the incident with the teenager Konorak Synthasamphone in 1991. The police were called to the scene. However, the situation was interpreted incorrectly, and Dahmer was not detained, and Konorak was subsequently killed the same night by Dahmer. The police officers literally handed the victim back into the hands of the killer that same evening. Later, this episode became a symbol of systemic errors and ignoring alarm signals. The investigation in Milwaukee for a long time did not link separate incidents into one chain. Complaints were considered in isolation, and the context of what was happening remained out of view. Only the accidental intervention of one of the witnesses led to the fact that the case finally received development. After the arrest, details were revealed that previously had not been checked or were missed. It turned out that a number of signals had arrived long before the final episode, but were not processed properly. And Oxford Apartments itself was demolished by the decision of the city mayor, and on the site of the apartments, a memorial was built in memory of the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer. Aileen Wuornos. The first documented cases date back to the late 1980s. Along the highways of the state of Florida, bodies of men began to be found. Episodes occurred in the areas of Volusia County, Marion County, and near Interstate 75. At first, the cases were not linked to each other. Different locations, different circumstances, absence of an obvious motive. The person who turned out to be at the center of the investigation was named Aileen Wuornos. She lived without permanent housing, earned money by prostitution, and moved around by hitchhiking. Her biography from childhood included runaways, violence, and a long stay on the margins of society. The first suspicions arose after personal belongings of the deceased began to be found in her possession. Documents, cars, bank cards. The investigation was led by detectives from the Volusia County Sheriff's Office, who paid attention to repeating routes and temporal coincidences. During interrogations, Wuornos claimed that she acted in self-defense. This version caused sharp disputes. Part of the investigators considered it as an attempt at justification. Others pointed to the context: isolation, constant threat, and lack of protection. The trial in Daytona Beach became one of the most discussed in Florida. The media actively formed an image in which Wuornos was presented either as a cold-blooded criminal or as a product of systemic violence. At the same time, practically no attention was paid to the identities of the deceased men. The case of Aileen Wuornos remains unique not because of the number of episodes, but because of how society turned out to be unprepared to work with a crime going beyond the usual framework of the profile. Here, there was no classic image of a serial killer. And it was precisely this that for a long time prevented seeing the complete picture. Andrei Chikatilo. The infamous serial killer from the Soviet Union, who gained popularity all over the world, first began to act in the late 70s in the Rostov Oblast. In the south of the Soviet Union, children and adolescents began to disappear. Reports came from different places: Shakhty, Novocherkassk, areas along railway stations. Each case was considered separately, and the idea of a serial crime was officially denied. The man standing behind these cases was named Andrei Chikatilo. He worked in ordinary positions, frequently changed jobs, and regularly used suburban trains. This allowed him to move between regions without attracting attention. The investigation was complicated by several factors at once. First, in the USSR, there was a conviction that serial killings are a Western phenomenon. Second, the militia experienced pressure to show quick results. As a result, Alexander Kravchenko was arrested and executed, who was later found innocent. In parallel, Chikatilo continued to remain at large. He came into the militia's field of view several times, underwent interrogations and medical checks, but was not detained. Discrepancies in early evidence and the lack of a common database prevented linking the episodes together. The turning point came in 1990, when an operative group under the leadership of investigator Viktor Burakov and psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky began using psychological profiling. It was Bukhanovsky who managed to build a behavior model which eventually led to the detention of Chikatilo. The trial took place in Rostov-on-Don and was closed. Case materials were not published for a long time, and many details became known only after the collapse of the USSR. Robert Hansen. In the late 1970s, in the city of Anchorage, Alaska, reports began to come in about the disappearance of women. Part of the disappearances occurred in the city itself, others after trips to remote areas outside of it. Due to the geography of the region, many cases were not linked to each other for a long time. The person who turned out to be at the center of the investigation was named Robert Hansen. He owned the bakery, Two Brothers Bakery, was married, and was considered a calm, withdrawn person. Hansen regularly flew on a small private plane, Piper PA-18 Super Cub, which in the conditions of Alaska did not look like something unusual. The first alarming signals appeared after one of the women managed to escape and report to the police details of what happened. Her testimony included a description of the plane, weapons, and remote areas near Knik River and Matanuska Valley. However, these words were not given importance for a long time due to the social status of the victim. The investigation moved forward only when the police discovered a map of Alaska with marked points. These places coincided with areas where bodies had previously been found. Additional evidence was obtained after analysis of flights and checks of property of Hansen. In 1983, he was arrested and later pleaded guilty. During interrogations, Hansen described in detail routes and locations that had previously remained out of the police's field of view due to the inaccessibility of the terrain. Paul Bernardo. In the 80s of the last century in the Scarborough area, province of Ontario, Canada, reports began to come in about serial sexual assaults. The criminal was nicknamed the Scarborough Rapist. Despite the scale, the investigation progressed slowly. The man linked to these cases was named Paul Bernardo. He lived in a suburb of Toronto, worked, had stable relationships, and did not stand out against the background of those around him. Bernardo submitted DNA samples several times, but due to delays and analysis errors, he was excluded from the list of suspects. In parallel, disappearances and murders occurred, which for a long time were not linked to the Scarborough Rapist case. Different police units treated the episodes as separate investigations. The lack of centralized coordination became a key problem. The turning point came after the investigation's attention was attracted by Karla Homolka, Bernardo's partner. It was through her that details began to be revealed which previously remained hidden. However, due to plea deals with the investigation, part of the information became known too late. The trial in Toronto was accompanied by sharp public criticism. It turned out that a number of episodes could have been prevented if data between cases had been combined earlier. Forensic errors and bureaucratic delays played a decisive role. Israel case. And finally, in today's video, we have the story of Israel Kais, one of the most mysterious stories about serial killers in today's episode. In the early 2000s, in different US states, disappearances occurred that were not linked to each other. Different victims, different regions, absence of a repeating modus operandi. It was precisely this that for a long time prevented seeing the overall picture. The man standing behind these episodes was named Israel Keyes. He lived in Anchorage, Alaska, served in the Army, worked in construction, and led an outwardly unremarkable life. Keyes regularly traveled around the country using air travel and car rentals, which allowed him not to be tied to one region. His approach differed fundamentally from other known cases. Keyes created caches in advance, so-called kill kits, in different parts of the USA. In them were tools hidden months or even years before the crimes. These caches were placed in forests, parks, and sparsely populated areas where he could return at any moment. Investigations did not progress because there were no obvious connections between the episodes. Keyes did not contact the press, did not leave messages, and did not try to attract attention. He consciously avoided repetition, understanding that it is precisely patterns that most often give away serial criminals. The turning point occurred in 2012 after the disappearance of Samantha Koenig in Anchorage. The use of her bank card and surveillance cameras allowed tracking Keyes' movements. He was detained in Lufkin, Texas, during an attempt to withdraw money. During interrogations, Keyes confessed to several murders. However, he refused to reveal the full scale. He carefully controlled the volume of information, exchanging confessions for privileges and conditions of detention. Investigators came to the conclusion that the number of his victims could be significantly larger than confirmed. The Israel Keyes case became an alarming signal for law enforcement agencies. It showed that a criminal consciously avoiding patterns can operate for years without leaving traces that could be combined into one investigation. Unlike other stories, here there is no complete list of episodes and a clear finale. There is only the understanding that part of what happened will remain unknown, because the man who built a system of concealment took a significant part of the information with him. All the stories in this video took place at different times and in different places, but in each case there were signals that were recorded but did not form a complete picture. Information was considered separately, some data was lost, and some remained without a reaction. The crimes continued not because of their complexity, but because of systemic gaps and errors. Over time, attention shifted to names and images, while the circumstances and causes remained behind the scenes. This video is coming to an end. Thank you for watching until the end. If you are interested in these kinds of breakdowns, write your suggestions in the comments, and perhaps the next video will feature the very topic you wanted me to cover. See you in the next episode.